The sun rose over the rolling hills of Andalusia, casting a golden glow over the worn fences and cracked earth of the once thriving Arroyo Ranch. Where there had once been laughter, cattle, and the proud whistles of ranchers, there was now silence, a silence thick with the weight of loss and fear, and in the heart of that silence stood a creature that had become legend, both feared and mourned. Storm. The black bull stood alone in the corral at the far edge of the property, his massive body rippling with restrained fury. His breath came out in low, smoky puffs in the cool morning air. Scars lined his flank, not from battles with other bulls, but from the countless attempts to subdue him. His eyes, dark and unreadable, never left the horizon. Storm had not always been a beast. 3 years ago, he had been just another calf. Skittish, yes, but nothing extraordinary. Until Caleb. Caleb was 17, with sunburned cheeks and a laugh that carried across the pastures like birdsong. He was the youngest hand on the ranch, but no one doubted his instincts with animals, especially Storm. They grew up together, bonded like brothers. Caleb fed him, trained him, even whispered secrets to him in the quiet before dawn. The bull followed the boy with the loyalty of a dog and the trust of a child. Then, one morning, everything shattered. No one knows exactly what happened. Some say Caleb slipped, others say Storm was startled by lightning. But when the other ranchers found them, the boy lay crumpled in the mud, and the bull stood over him, unmoving. Caleb died before the ambulance arrived. Storm changed that day. He refused to eat for a week. Then, without warning, he attacked the first vet who entered his pen. Fences were trampled, men were tossed. One suffered broken ribs, another never came back. Over the next year, 3 more tried to break Storm. None succeeded. One barely escaped with his life. The local authorities began pressing the ranch to put the bull down. Uncontrollable, they said, a risk to everyone. But John, Caleb's father, refused. Every day, John walked to the corral. He didn't speak, he didn't bring food. He just stood there watching the bull that had once followed his son like a shadow. People whispered that John had lost his mind, that grief had rotted his reason. But John didn't care. Storm was the last living piece of Caleb, and letting him go felt like losing his boy all over again. The ranch, meanwhile, suffered. Without Caleb's calm influence and with Storm dominating the headlines, investors pulled out. The herd dwindled. Workers left. Even nature seemed to grieve. The soil cracked, the river thinned, and the grass grew brittle and brown. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, a dusty jeep rolled up the long drive. Eric Thompson stepped out first, tall, clean-cut in his late 30s, with a worn leather bag and a veterinarian's badge clipped to his jacket. His credentials were impeccable, years of field work, glowing references, and one trait the ranch had learned to value above all else: patience. Beside him, holding his hand, was a boy. "Luke," Eric said gently. "Stay close." Luke was 4, with sandy blonde hair and wide green eyes that blinked up at the wide expanse of land like he'd stepped into a dream. He clutched a stuffed elephant in one hand and his dad's fingers in the other. John was waiting for them by the barn, flanked by 2 remaining ranch hands. He looked older than his years, his beard untrimmed, eyes bloodshot, shoulders heavy with a grief he no longer bothered to hide. "You're the new vet?" John asked. Eric nodded. "I heard about Storm." John's eyes narrowed slightly. Everyone's heard about Storm. There was no handshake, no small talk, just a long stare between 2 men who both knew what it meant to lose too much. Behind them, Luke tugged on Eric's sleeve. "Daddy," he whispered, pointing. "Is that him?" All heads turned. Storm stood at the far end of the pasture, still as a statue, eyes fixed on the new arrivals. His breath flared, his muscles tensed. "Yeah," Eric said quietly. "That's him." Luke's eyes locked with the bull's. For a moment no one spoke. "All right," John said, breaking the silence. "You'll be staying in the bunkhouse. I'll show you where." But before they could turn to go, the wind shifted, and with it, a hush fell over the group. Luke's hand slipped from his father's. "Luke?" Eric turned, panic already blooming in his voice. "Buddy, stay." But the boy was already walking, slowly, straight toward the fence. "No," John barked. "Get him back, that animal will kill him." Eric lunged, but Luke had crossed the dusty path. He stopped just a few feet from the old wooden fence separating him from the most feared creature in Andalusia. Storm didn't move, his ears flicked, his tail swished once. Then he stepped forward. Every muscle in John's body went rigid. One of the ranch hands drew in a sharp breath. Luke reached up, pressing his small hand gently against the fence post, inches from the bull's face. Storm took one more step, and then another. Dust swirled. The giant black bull lowered his head and stood still. No snorting, no charging, no fury, just stillness. Eric's voice was a whisper. "Jesus." John couldn't breathe. The boy giggled softly. "Hi," he said. Storm blinked, exhaled, and for the first time in 3 years, the rage in his body seemed to drain, replaced by something else, something no one could quite understand. From the shadows of the porch, John watched in silence as Storm, the bull who had torn fences apart, who had nearly killed 3 men, stood like a statue before a child, unmoving, unthreatening. He didn't know it yet, but the winds over the ranch were changing, and Storm was listening. No one moved. The only sound across the ranch was the whisper of the wind and the faint rustle of dust beneath Luke's shoes as he stood, small and fearless, just beyond the fence. Storm stood equally still. His massive frame loomed above the boy, muscles tense, nostrils flaring. Every adult on the ranch held their breath, waiting for the inevitable, the charge, the roar, the chaos. But it never came. Luke took one more step. "Luke!" Eric's voice cracked, trembling with panic. He started toward the boy, but John grabbed his arm. "Wait," John whispered. "Look." Storm lowered his head. Slowly, heavily, like the weight of years pressing down on his spine, the bull's neck dipped toward the earth. His eyes, wild and unreadable just moments ago, softened, blinking slowly as if recognizing something, someone. Luke reached up and pressed his tiny hand to the wooden beam. Storm inched closer until the tip of his nose brushed the space just beside Luke's fingers. And then, gently, impossibly, the boy reached through the fence and touched him. A murmur rose from the ranch hands watching from afar. Eric's heart hammered in his chest. John didn't dare speak. He'd seen that bull throw a grown man across a field, but now Storm simply stood there, calm as a stone, as a 4-year-old traced his fingers along the scarred bridge of his nose. "He's not bad," Luke said softly. Storm exhaled, a deep, thunderous breath that ruffled the boy's hair. That was the moment everything changed. For the rest of that day, Storm refused to leave the fence line. Luke sat on a low wooden stool just a few feet away, swinging his legs, humming softly to himself, occasionally holding out a piece of apple through the gap in the rails. The bull took it each time, lips brushing gently against the boy's fingers, never snapping, never jerking. Eric paced nearby, torn between awe and terror. "This isn't normal," he muttered for the 100th time. "This defies everything I've studied." John stood with arms crossed, his eyes never leaving Storm. "It's not science," he said quietly. "It's something else." The ranch hands weren't convinced. By sunset, whispers of concern had already begun. One worker suggested it was a fluke. Another warned they were putting the child in danger. "A wild animal's a wild animal," he said, "even if it sleeps in your yard." But Luke returned the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that, and Storm waited for him each time. Within a week, Storm's entire demeanor began to shift. He stopped pacing restlessly in his pen. He stopped charging the fence whenever a human came close. When Luke was near, he lay down, something no one had seen him do in 3 years, with his head resting gently on his front hooves, watching the boy build towers from stones and talk about the shapes of clouds. Eric started keeping notes. Subject, Storm. Behavioral change, noted. Extreme reduction in aggression. Trigger, presence of child. Luke. Hypothesis, emotional imprinting. Trauma response reversal. Unknown. Theories swirled in Eric's head, but none fit. Not really. One afternoon, as Luke leaned against the fence humming the tune of a lullaby his mother used to sing, Storm shuffled forward and rested his massive head against the wood. Luke leaned back against him like a pillow. The moment burned itself into Eric's mind, a 4-year-old wrapped in trust and a bull buried in grief. Even the most skeptical ranch hands began to soften. They stopped calling Storm the monster. Some even approached the fence when Luke was present, tossing food over or cleaning out the trough. One brave soul reached out to pat Storm's shoulder. The bull ignored him completely, his eyes fixed only on the boy. John, meanwhile, said little. He spent more and more time sitting near the fence, sometimes a few yards away, sometimes closer. He rarely spoke to Storm directly, but there were moments when Luke was busy collecting rocks and the light hit just right, when John's eyes would fill and he'd whisper his son's name, Caleb. He didn't say it like a man mourning. He said it like a man remembering. "Do you think he sees something in Luke?" Eric asked one evening, sitting beside John beneath a flickering barn light. John didn't answer at first. He stared out into the dark pasture, where Storm stood guard beside the fence as Luke napped on a blanket. "I used to think Storm was cursed," John finally said. "Now, I wonder if he was just waiting." For what? For someone to remind him he wasn't alone. Eric didn't push. Some grief is too old, too deep to poke at, but peace rarely lasts. It started as a low rumble on the horizon. By nightfall, the skies had turned black. Thunder cracked open the heavens, and lightning streaked across the hills like veins of fire. The ranch scrambled, tarps flew, horses screamed in their stalls, rain pounded the roof like a war drum. Storm, agitated and snorting, paced wildly in his enclosure. The wind tore through the wooden rails, shaking them loose. Eric ran toward the fence, flashlight bouncing in his hand. John shouted orders to the ranch hands over the roar of the storm. Then came the snap. A bolt of lightning struck the far tree line, and with a crack like a gunshot, one of the main support beams holding Storm's corral buckled. The fence collapsed. "Storm's out!" someone screamed. Eric's flashlight caught a glimpse of the bull charging into the darkness, mane rippling, hooves hammering the mud. "Lock the gates," John roared. "Keep everyone inside." But it was too late. Storm was gone, vanished into the wild, into the storm that had given him his name. Eric turned, heart racing, already reaching for his phone. Authorities would need to be called. A tranquilizer team. Maybe worse. John didn't speak. He just stared into the blackness, his fists clenched. Far behind them, a small voice called out, sleepy and confused. "Daddy?" Luke stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse, rubbing his eyes, unaware that his friend, the gentle giant who had laid his head in his lap, had disappeared into the night. And with him went the fragile hope they had just begun to believe in. Storm ran. The ground shook beneath his hooves as he tore across the hills, driven not by rage, but panic. Lightning still danced across the sky, and thunder rolled behind him like a stampede. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving, away from the fences, away from the noise, away from the pain. Back at the ranch, chaos erupted. The collapse of the fence left a gaping hole in the corral, and Storm's escape was already spreading like wildfire. Emergency calls were made, radios buzzed, government vehicles arrived before dawn. By sunrise, the ranch was surrounded. Trucks with animal control logos parked in a tight semicircle. Men in vests loaded tranquilizer rifles. Drones were sent up. A state official named Robert King stepped out of a black SUV with a folder under one arm and a scowl on his face. "This bull is a known threat," he announced. "He's attacked multiple people and now he's loose. We're not waiting for another incident." Eric met him near the main gate. "Sir, I understand the concern, but things have changed. I have documented behavioral shifts, unprecedented ones, based entirely on contact with a specific child." King didn't even blink. "You expect me to base a state safety decision on a 4-year-old? He's more than a kid," Eric said. "He's the only one who's ever reached that animal. That has to mean something." "It means the bull didn't kill him, yet." King turned to his team. "We find the animal. If it resists, we put it down." John arrived moments later, his boots soaked in rain and mud, eyes blazing. "You'll go through me first," he said. King barely glanced at him. "You've had 3 years to handle this." "This isn't about control anymore," John said. "It's about healing. That bull didn't break." He was broken. King sighed. This isn't a therapy session, Mr. Walker. It's a public risk containment. Across the ranch, no one noticed the tiny figure listening from behind a stack of hay bales. Luke. His heart pounded in his chest, his small fists clenched around the straps of his backpack. He didn't understand every word they said, but he understood enough. They were going to hurt Storm. He couldn't let that happen. Luke waited until the grown-ups were distracted. Then he slipped out the side of the barn, crossed the dewy grass and climbed over the back fence. No one saw him go. The forest was still damp from the storm. Twigs cracked under his feet. Mud pulled at his sneakers. But Luke pressed on, deeper into the trees, calling softly, "Storm, it's me. It's Luke." He didn't know how far he walked. He just kept following the path the way Storm used to watch the hills, quiet, careful, eyes wide. And then, near a small grove where the trees bent like arches, he found him. Storm was lying in the tall grass, half covered in mud, breathing heavy. His eyes were wide, flinching at every sound. He looked less like a beast and more like a child lost in a nightmare. "Storm," Luke whispered. The bull's ears twitched. Luke stepped into the clearing. "It's okay now." Storm didn't move. So the boy dropped his bag, walked up to the giant creature, and placed both hands against his soaked, scarred shoulder. "I found you," he said softly. "Come home." Storm trembled, and then, slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes met Luke's. Not wild, not afraid, just tired. Back at the ranch, panic had set in. "He's gone," Eric said, scanning the property. "Luke's gone." The realization hit John like a punch to the chest. They searched the fields, the barns, the woods. Nothing. Then, from the top of the hill, a shout echoed, "We found them!" Everyone turned toward the old barn, the one long abandoned, half collapsed from age, and there, in front of it, stood Luke, holding the gate open, and behind him, emerging from the trees like a shadow out of legend, was Storm. Gasps erupted across the field. Eric ran, shouting the boy's name, but Luke raised one small hand. "Wait!" Storm stepped forward, muddy and massive, but calm. His eyes scanned the crowd. Men raised rifles. "Hold your fire," Eric screamed. King raised a hand to his crew. "Don't shoot yet." Luke stood in the center of the clearing, small, fragile, but unshaken. Storm walked straight toward him, ranch hands tensed. One man muttered, "Dear God." But the bull didn't charge. He stopped in front of the boy, lowered his great head, and gently pressed it against Luke's chest. Time stopped. Not a sound, not a breath. Just a child and a bull, broken things made whole in the presence of one another. Luke wrapped his arms around Storm's face. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe." King took a step forward, his mouth open, then closed it again. Slowly, he lowered his clipboard. "Get those guns down," he said. The rifles dropped. John reached the edge of the field, eyes wet. "Caleb," he whispered under his breath, "is that you?" Eric placed a hand on his shoulder. Storm didn't move. Luke didn't let go. And for the first time in years, something powerful, something wordless, settled over the ranch. Not fear, not mourning, but peace. They didn't shoot. No one could explain exactly why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was disbelief. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something bigger, something sacred, that held every trigger finger still. Storm stood with his head pressed against Luke's chest, the boy's arms wrapped gently around his scarred face. In that moment, the legend of the dangerous bull shattered. What remained wasn't a beast but a soul, wounded but finally seen. The next day, the governor's office issued a temporary stay on Storm's euthanization order. Within a week, it became permanent. The bull would not be destroyed. Instead, under heavy regulation and oversight, he would be allowed to remain at Arroyo Ranch under John Walker's supervision. Specialists were brought in to assess him. Veterinarians, behavioral psychologists, even trauma experts. Storm cooperated with all of them, so long as Luke was nearby. News spread like wildfire. A local reporter published the first article, "The Boy Who Tamed the Storm." Within days, national outlets picked it up. Interviews were requested. Photos of Luke and Storm standing side by side went viral. But fame wasn't what the ranch focused on. Instead, something new began to grow in the place that had once been quiet with grief. Hope. John Walker spent long hours walking the fence line, but now his steps were lighter. He had begun to speak again, to the workers, to Eric, even to Storm. One morning he brought out an old faded photograph of Caleb as a boy, riding a pony in the same pasture where Storm now grazed. He placed the photo in the barn. "I used to think keeping you alive meant keeping Caleb here," he said quietly, kneeling in the hay beside Storm. "But I was wrong." The bull nudged him gently with his head. "You're not what I lost," John whispered. "You're what I survived." From then on, John stopped avoiding the memories. He welcomed them. The transformation of the ranch happened slowly, then all at once. What began as a therapeutic observation project evolved into something more meaningful. Eric partnered with pediatric therapists and animal-assisted therapy organizations. They brought children from hospitals, special education centers, and trauma recovery programs. And Storm responded. He was gentle, patient, still when he needed to be, curious but careful. One child after another sat with him, brushed him, even hugged him. Some laughed for the first time in months. Others cried without fear. Then came the girl named Grace. She was 7, nonverbal on the spectrum and terrified of touch. Her mother brought her in with hesitation, explaining she didn't expect much. "She doesn't connect easily," she said, "with anyone." But Storm walked slowly toward the child. Kneeling, as if sensing her need for safety, he lowered his massive body to the grass and waited. Grace stared at him. Then, with tiny, trembling steps, she reached forward, not to touch, but to place a flower on the ground near his hoof. Storm sniffed it and let it be. The next moment changed everything. Grace turned to her mother, eyes wide, and spoke her first words in months. "He's soft." Her mother dropped to her knees in tears, and Storm, he blinked once, and lowered his head again as if in gentle acknowledgement. Visitors came often now, not to see a spectacle but to witness healing. The ranch built a small center beside the barn, filled with quiet rooms, sensory tools, and shaded benches. Therapists worked alongside ranchers. Storm became the symbol of their mission, not a mascot but a miracle. And through it all, Luke remained by his side. He didn't speak much about what he'd done. He didn't need to. Children don't save lives for praise. They do it because they see what others cannot, because they trust where others fear, because love, in its purest form, is unafraid. On the anniversary of the day Storm had escaped, the ranch held a quiet ceremony. A new plaque was installed at the barn entrance. It read, "In memory of Caleb Walker, and in honor of Storm, the one he left behind. May healing find those who hurt, and peace find those who wait." Dozens of families came to watch. Among them, Grace stood beside her mother, holding a small bouquet of sunflowers. Eric stood with John by the pasture, Luke between them. "He still kneels sometimes," John said softly, eyes on Storm. "Not for food, not from pain, only when Luke's nearby." Eric nodded. "I've never seen anything like it." As if on cue, Storm lifted his head from the grass. He saw Luke across the field, and then, slowly, he moved. The crowd hushed as the massive bull approached. When he reached the center of the pasture, in full view of the gathering, he did something that stunned everyone. He knelt, not from injury, not from exhaustion, but as a gesture, as a choice. Luke stepped forward. No one said a word. The Andalusian sun broke over the hills behind him, casting golden light across the grass. Dust floated in the air like sparks. Luke placed a hand on Storm's back, and then, with quiet confidence, he climbed onto the bull's broad, scarred back. Storm rose slowly, tall, proud, gentle. The crowd stood in silence, watching a boy sit atop the beast the world had once called dangerous. But in that moment, he was not a threat. He was not a relic of tragedy. He was proof. Proof that even the broken can heal, that even the feared can be loved, and that peace at last had come to Arroyo Ranch.